it's a daily recommitment.
That's good.
Right? Like every morning when you wake up, if you're going to lead other people, and like you said, in a very public way, especially mistakes, then you have to make sure you're recommitting to the people that you're leading first.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us today on the Real Estate Mastery Podcast. And we are in for a real treat because we have the one and only Chase Williams. Now, why I say you're in for a treat, they're always great people we interview, but Chase and I actually have some experience together where Chase was the guy a few years back who at a real estate event took me to the side and said, "Hey, Rick, there's an opportunity about being a team leader." And so I've actually had the privilege of working with Chase as my boss, as my leader, and as a friend. And so today we get to just chat really about leadership mindset. We'll see where the conversation goes, but it's one thing to say someone's a great leader, but to be able to say that they're a great leader as you have served under them and seen it firsthand, I just want to start our conversation with that. So Chase said he wished he had cooler titles when we kind of did our little intro conversation together before the podcast. And he is the area director for the Keller Williams Northwest region, and he is the operating principal of Keller Williams Spokane. And I said, well, maybe, a cooler title would be CEO of the world. I don't think he quite feels up to that.
Not qualified.
But, anyway, Chase, so it's really great having you here with us today.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, you're welcome. So leadership, that's a big word. It's a word that's thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
Good leaders, bad leaders, leadership styles, you name it. And so when you hear that word leadership, in your experience, how would you describe what leadership is?
Well, I've heard a few different definitions over, the course of my career, Rick. And I guess what I would say before I lead into how I would describe it, one thing that I'm passionate about around this concept of leadership is, and you've heard me say this before, I truly believe that the world is starving for good leaders, right? And you don't have to look very far to see that, whether it's in politics or business or families, communities, right? Like there's a hunger for good leadership, and even more so for great leadership, which is pretty rare. And so I'm certainly not there where I would want to be on my journey, but to me, leadership is a responsibility of those that others are following, right? And you could say leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. That's a definition I've heard before. Gary Keller, who's one of my mentors, says that leadership is teaching people how to think, so that they can do the things that they need to do in order to get the things that they want when they want them, right? So teaching people how to think is a short way of saying that. And I think all of those are right. I often say that it's a little bit more art than science, right? So it's like leadership isn't black and white either. It's like, if this, then that, if this, then that, right? It'd be a lot simpler if it was.
Sure.
But when you're talking about leading other human beings, whether that's in an influential way or teaching them how to think, a lot of gray area in there, right? So I think that it's a big responsibility, and some people feel called to it, led to it. Some find themselves as a leader accidentally. And yet that doesn't change the level of responsibility, I think, for those that they have, rather, for those that they're leading. So it's a big word, right? And I don't know if there's a right or wrong way to describe it, but there's certainly a need for it, I think.
Yeah. I remember you sharing that with me before and how impactful that was. In fact, before we met today, I put that as one of my notes, just that idea that leadership, the world is starving for leadership. They're hungry for it. And that's why this is such an important topic. And even those different definitions that you gave, each has an angle of value and truth to them. And so when you talk about human beings, people, like leadership affects so profoundly someone's life and their future, and how you lead an organization, how you lead your family, how you lead in your church, whatever your context is, has drastic impact. And so it's so important then that as leaders, it's like you're saying, a journey, and there's the gray area. It's not a black and white, which makes it so exciting and challenging. For you with that leadership, how have you grown in that area? Like for you, as you've moved through different seasons of your life, what are some areas where you've said, okay, this is an area I'm lacking or was lacking, and you really kind of leaned into that to grow for your own journey?
Yeah, I love that question. And, frankly, there's so many areas I'm lacking, and it'd be hard to point one out. But I would say this, Rick, like I've been incredibly blessed and fortunate to have followed a lot of great leaders. And, I think it's important that you're a great follower as well in order to be a good leader. And so I've just had the opportunity to be mentored by, led by, had bosses, if you want to think of it that
Sure.
way. And even my parents, right? Like all the way up. So like, I feel super lucky that that's one of the ways I've developed in my leadership is just kind of modeling after and following and learning from other people that I thought were great leaders.
Yeah.
Part of that is studying leadership, right? So whether that's reading leadership books or going to conferences and unpacking different methods or models around quality leadership is another way I think that I've worked to try to develop that skill, right? Because there's maybe whatever element is, God-given, if you will, or kind of granted to you, still needs a high level for me of refinement and growth. And so those are some of the practical things. I'm constantly listening to podcasts and educating myself around what it looks like to be a better leader. I would say, though, above all of that, which is all incredibly valuable to growth in any area, whether it's leadership or something else, right, is practice.
Okay.
And the thing about practicing in leadership is, there's no way to practice other than in the game, in the moment. Right? Like it's really hard to role play leadership. Although there's elements of that you can kind of practice. Ultimately, you're practicing by leading people.
Right.
And that's a little scary, right? Even saying it out loud, it's like, oh, you're practicing on people. Well, yeah, that's how you're developing as a leader. You're in the arena, right? You're in the space of leading others, and you get it wrong. You get it right sometimes too, but you learn when you get it wrong. And that's a really hard way to learn, which is what I think causes a lot of people to shy away from or even opt out of leadership. And not that it's for everyone, right?
Sure.
I think there's an element of it that's for everyone, but to the degree that you pursue it professionally is different. It's really daunting to consider that you're going to cut your teeth and learn and make mistakes on other people.
Right.
And that's legitimately going to have an impact on them. Potentially negative when you screw up, right? And when I say you, I mean me.
I get it.
And so being willing to continue down the pathway and continue leading others, albeit in a very imperfect way, I think is the best way to develop that skill or that muscle.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting concept, right?
Yeah. Well, and you highlight, it's a great illustration about you're in the court, you're on the court, you're playing the game, and there's other people in that game, and your mistakes are very public. Just like when we think of watching the interception in the football game or you name it. How do you, as a leader, then manage that? Right, that there's an expectation as the leader that you're taking charge, you're leading your team, you're helping them get to somewhere, and yet along the way, there is no perfect leader, like you're saying. How do you manage that as someone, for our people listening? How do you go about leading someone imperfectly?
Well, I think there's a couple things that come to mind when you ask that, right? One is like, hopefully you're approaching it with the right heart, the right integrity. So even though you're going to make mistakes, we all are, and being in leadership is no different. I think that there's some level of comfort in knowing that you're doing the best you can for the person or the people you're leading in a very imperfect way, right? And so you have their best interest in mind, and you are coming at it with a high level of integrity and desire to help them succeed or grow or develop whatever it is you may be leading them in. And there's a little bit of comfort in that. So it's like, oh my gosh, like I'm giving as much effort as possible to help this person develop. So when I do mess up or I say the wrong thing or I make the wrong decision, I can lean back on my intention. Now, that's a tricky word too, right? Like we've all heard this saying, like the road to hell's paved with good intentions. And I get that. And yet, like if I can't look someone in the eye and genuinely believe that I'm there to help improve their life or help them grow or support them in some way as a leader, then, I don't know why you'd be there in the first place.
Right.
And so there's a little bit of comfort in that, but I think it also just takes the willingness, the courage maybe to accept the fact that you're going to get it wrong sometimes, and hopefully that you're going to learn from those mistakes so that you don't keep getting it wrong in the same areas. But yeah, it's tough, right? Like I always think of leadership as it's a daily recommitment.
That's good.
Right? Like every morning when you wake up, if you're going to lead other people, and like you said, in a very public way, especially mistakes, then you have to make sure you're recommitting to the people that you're leading first, and then the journey that leadership is, right?
Yep.
I think of it, one of the very accurate kind of parallels with leadership is parenting.
Okay.
Right? And by the way, parenting is leadership.
Uh-huh.
But I use it as an analogy a lot, right? Because it's kind of like you talk about practicing on people as a leader. Well, I don't know about you, Rick, because we both have kids, but when I had my first child, I was not an expert at parenting.
Right? and we still aren't.
I was the opposite of expert, right?
Yeah.
Even calling me an amateur would be gracious. So I didn't know anything about parenting, even though I thought I did, but I learned real quick I didn't. And yet, here my kids are now 14 and almost 12. And I've been practicing on them every day since, and I still am.
Right.
Right. And I've gotten it wrong plenty of times, but I've gotten it right too. And so that's a good example of leaning back on like my belief that I'm here as a father for them to help them grow and develop and think differently, and influencing them into doing the things that are going to create a great life for them.
Uh-huh.
So when I screw up, which I'm bound to, I can lean back on continuing that process, right?
Yeah. And that also ties into they're your family, right? Like you're interwoven, you're connected from the beginning to kingdom come.
Yep.
And thinking of that context as that illustration back to like a team, back to leadership, though you will make mistakes publicly, though you'll make bad decisions, though things will happen, that's your family in a sense, if we think of that illustration, where if you have the right vision, if you have the right relationships, the right mindset together, you can actually get away with a lot of mistakes. Not that that's the intention on your part.
Sure, of course
but
not.
When you have a strong vision, when you have a strong culture, those are the kind of things where your team rallies around you, your family rallies around you. So in leadership, how does that look? How do you cast a vision that brings people around you in such a way that they want to go through that very public journey with you?
Well, I think, vision is also a big word.
Uh-huh.
And, but if you think about it, it's no more than being able to see farther than others, right? And then articulate and communicate that to others. And when I say see farther, it might only be an inch farther, right? Like sometimes we think of these very like high level visionary people, and there are some, by the way, like there's some that can see years ahead of other people, right? These are like the Steve Jobs of the world, right? I think of Gary Keller as an example, but the point is like they are few and far between, right? A lot of leaders are able to see a little farther than those that they lead, because they're looking out there.
Right. They're
not smarter. They're not better. They're just looking on a different plane than others, and they're willing to do that, right? And they're willing to do that for the benefit of those that they lead.
Yep.
So I'll give you an example in real estate, right? Most agents, by the way, the best agents on the planet, well, every day they're thinking about the things that they need to be thinking about. They're thinking about the clients that they're currently serving. They're thinking about the clients that they're hoping to serve in the near future, and all that goes with those very emotional and sometimes difficult transactions, someone's home, right? And they're thinking about all the factors that exist in the marketplace, et cetera, that are impacting those clients, right? And that's why they're great agents, because they're focused on the client experience, and they should be, right? As leaders in the industry, we're focused on that too, but we're thinking about, okay, what's going to happen in the industry in the next 5 years that may impact that client experience that we can get ahead of?
Right.
How do we need to be thinking about training or technology or even leadership that's going to guide these agents focused on their clients to maybe provide that service in a different way 5 or 10 years from now, right? So again, it's If they're looking in the short term or closer to their feet where they're walking, because that's what they need to do, then leaders are required to look out a little farther so that they can make sure those people don't accidentally walk off a cliff because they're not looking up.
Right.
Right. And so vision is a little bit of that, seeing out a little farther. And I think seeing it is one thing, communicating it and rallying people to it is another. A lot of people have great vision in their head, but it's hard to connect the dots to me describing to you what I see in the future and why it might be important and why you would even care about it, let alone join in on a cause to achieve it.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's that communication piece, connecting what's in my brain or someone's brain to those that might also get excited about that or it might bring value to, et cetera. And that's really the trick around casting vision. And I think, again, it's practice, right? It's thinking about what it looks like, articulating it to yourself, and then figuring out, like, how would I describe this to someone? And then understanding that they're always going to ask in the back of their head, well, what's in it for me? And knowing what that is, right? It's like almost like a feature and benefit. It's like, here's what it looks like, but here's why you would care, right? And the thing about vision and leadership is when done well, it will repel almost as many people as it attracts.
Okay.
Right? Now, that doesn't mean like you might attract millions of people, for example, or thousands or hundreds or tens. But when you have a really clear vision, you're going to attract the right people. And the people that aren't right are going to be like, I'm not even interested in that.
Right. But clarity is power.
Like, that sounds really cool, but it's not for me.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that level of clarity is important to a strong vision, because if you want to accomplish big things, and big is a relative term,
sure,
then you have to have the right people that you're leading, not just people in general. Right? Like I'll use another analogy. If I want to build a really big church that's focused on the Bible, I wouldn't want to recruit necessarily, at least initially, a whole bunch of people that don't believe in God and don't believe in the Bible.
Right.
Right? Now, I might look to impact those people long term, but I want to cast a vision that says, here's who we are and here's why we're that and here's the value it can bring to the people that attend and the community at large, right? Because I'm hoping to attract the people that connect to that.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think back to the Bible and Jesus, right? He had the 12 disciples. They might have been fishermen or, a tax collector who changed his ways in following him, but he didn't have the Pharisees in there with him, right? He didn't have the religious elite who weren't a part of what he was doing. But eventually some of them ended up following.
Yep.
Real Estate Mastery family, thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to quickly bring to your attention one of the biggest pain points in the investment and real estate community, and that is roofs that go bad. What can happen, of course, is if you get a leak through a roof, it can destroy the entire interior of your home. If you're having a real estate transaction and a roof comes up in a home inspection and the buyer says, hey, we want a new roof, and by the way, that's going to cost $30,000. Or if you're a long-term investor and you have a property that has a roof replacement, that can wipe out years of profitability. And so we've decided to partner with a company called Roofmaxx, who actually specializes in extending the life of older asphalt shingle roofs to save you both time and money. And how it actually works is as simple as it's a bio oil they spray onto those shingles, it absorbs in, and it takes away that brittleness, extending the life of an asphalt roof on average between 6 to 8 years, and has a 5-year transferable warranty. So if you ever go to sell that property, it goes with that property at a fraction of the price of replacement, typically around 15%. So if you're interested, click the link in the description for your free evaluation today. Okay, so Chase, as we talk about vision, and having that clarity to communicate it in such a way where people are actually saying, hey, I'm on board, or I'm actually totally out on this thing. But clarity of vision, right? Clarity is really powerful. As a leader, how much time, if you could speak about your own life, do you focus actually on like creating that clear vision, going back to that vision? Because often it seems as if the leader can find themselves stuck in the weeds, or maybe almost falling off the cliff as well, because they can lose sight of that. And then of course the trickle effect is really powerful. So I think we know how important vision is for a leader to have, but what does it look like, and how do you keep that vision strong in front of you for the different things that you have going on in your world?
Yeah, good question. I would say in terms of like how much time spent on it, never enough.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and you're absolutely right. There's this competing idea of, okay, well, I need to know what the vision is, clarify the vision, communicate the vision, recruit people to the vision, hold people, empower people inside the vision, hold them accountable to the vision. There's these steps that you go through, right? It's all related back to vision. And there's a lot to do in life and business, no doubt. There's no shortage amount of things to do. And sometimes we get busy doing. And that's important part too for succeeding, for succeeding in anything worthwhile is the amount of doing. But sometimes we get lost in that because doing is actually simpler than spending time on the vision, right? And sitting down and having time to reflect on, are we still in alignment with the vision? Is it still the right vision? Are we still passionate about that? Has something changed in our industry or in the business that requires us to maybe rethink the vision, right? So like, no doubt, full disclosure, like I would say a lot of leaders would probably tell you like, I wish I spent more time on that, or I should spend more time on that rather. So I think that's an element of just creating space for that. Again, like anytime you create space for something that feels like, oh, it's thinking time or it's checking in on the vision time, like there's a lot of stuff that'll compete for those same hours on the calendar. So being real protective around that, even though it might feel like in the moment it's unproductive, it's one of the most productive things a leader can do.
Yep.
Right. And in terms of, we talked a little bit about communicating the vision. I don't think you can over communicate the vision, right? Almost like great leaders are good parrots. They're constantly talking about the vision. They're constantly tying every decision back to the vision, every result back to the vision, every lack of result back to the vision, because that's the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish, right? And so it's reconnecting those that you lead back to what it looks like, why it matters, what's in it for them, rather than just the nuts and bolts of the things we need to accomplish each day, right? Like I saw it actually. I saw the quote today, and it maybe wasn't a quote, it was like a story that JFK went and visited NASA back when they were, trying to go to the moon. And he met someone who was cleaning the restrooms, right? And he asked the janitor, in essence, what he did there. And he said, I'm helping put a man on the moon.
Love that.
Right? So it was like they had created such a strong vision around the importance of that for America at that time in history, that the janitor cleaning the bathrooms understood that he was helping put a man on the moon.
Yep.
So that's kind of I thought that's a strong illustration of the importance of coming back to the vision. So yeah, from a time perspective, never enough probably.
That's powerful though, because that's just as that example of every person on your team, whatever the role is, having that same mindset and having that clarity. Because if you're, having been a janitor myself, it was at a church, and if I didn't have the clarity as to why I was that janitor at that time, because I was doing an internship in their youth ministry program, I would have been out. I don't want to clean toilets. Who wants to clean toilets? But with a strong vision, people will follow you just about anywhere.
Yep, you got it.
So earlier you talked about systems and kind of the art or creativity side of leadership. And as we talk about vision, that's kind of that art side of it. There's a system of communicating it. How, as you lead some larger organizations, how do you, for those listening who have that ability to cast a big vision, create momentum, kind of get the troops going, keep them moving, often we can be the ones who struggle with the system side of it. So for a leader, how do you grow that muscle? How do you engage with your people in such a way where you actually are helping them logistically, strategically, systematically move forward in what their roles are within that vision?
Great question. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind, Rick. One is finding the right cadence.
Okay.
Right. And or rhythm, some might call it, right? So when you talk about a system of leadership, it could be as simple as like, hey, we're going to meet 1 hour a week and we're going to talk about how you're doing in the pursuit of your goals inside of the vision, right? So depending on what your role is, that's our cadence, right? Or maybe, hey, we're going to meet for 15 minutes every morning in like a little huddle as a leadership team. And we're going to remind each other what the vision is, what the mission is, and then we're going to check in on some key things on a daily basis that are moving us closer to that. That's a cadence or a rhythm.
Yep.
And so that, believe it or not, that's a system. right? Like, leadership is about helping other people think. And that's usually best done, one-on-one or in small groups, right? And for those that you lead directly, there's an accountability element to that, right? Because accountability is the word that a lot of people don't like to talk about, but is so important to effective leadership. It could be as simple as asking someone how they're doing in the pursuit of their goals each week. That's a form of accountability.
Right.
There's different levels of it, right? But I think, when you think about a system, it's that cadence. And there's some tools around it. Like, some people have what we would call a cash talk, and it's just a model. And that's another form of finding consistency in leadership, is following certain models. Like, well, what questions should I be asking, and how often should I be asking them? And then what is it like to be supporting that person in the pursuit of what they want, right? So you have your a certain cadence and rhythm with those that you lead, and then you have certain models that you would follow in question asking, for example.
Yeah.
Right. And the art part, when I talk about it being more art than science, it's because every person you lead is different. So if there was just like a black and white numerical kind of,
Sure.
if 1 happens, then do 2, or if 3 happens, then do 4 leadership manual, right? Like, it would be near impossible for that to ever exist, because everyone you lead is different. They have a different background. They have different upbringing. They have different ideas, different natural behavioral styles and personalities, different circumstances that are going in their life every single day. And those are constantly changing. So when you think about it being more art than science, it's like, okay, what's happening right now in this relationship with this person as it pertains to the vision or mission of the company? And then how do I need to lead accordingly?
Yeah.
There's no manual for that.
Right.
And so you have to have the ability to kind of flex depending on who you're leading and what the circumstance calls for and what the urgency around it is, how crucial it is to the vision of the company. Those are all, decisions that take a little bit of experience, a little bit of intuition, and a little bit of courage.
Yeah.
Because again, you can get it wrong as fast as you can get it right, sometimes faster.
Sure. That's great. So how about mentorship within this leadership idea, right? Coaching, mentorship. You've talked about the importance of, essentially leaders have to be learners, constantly stretching yourself. When I got to work with you, I had a coach, through Keller Williams, and coaching changed my world. You coached me, mentored me. How important has that been in your life when it comes to having someone who's feeding into you? You mentioned Gary Keller. Tell us a little bit about the importance of that and who those people have been in your life.
Yeah, well, I think that you cannot overstate the importance, in my opinion. No one succeeds alone, first of all. And you become a product of those that you hang around or spend time with, right? We've all heard that. You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. However you want to think about that. It's absolutely true, 100%. And so who you allow to speak into your life or mentor you or coach you is super important. And so I would start there. And some of the kind of advice I've given before, and I try to take it myself, of course,
Sure.
is we live in an era now of people even call themselves influencers, right? It's a social media thing. It's like,
right.
Here we are laying down content for a podcast, which is super fun and hopefully it's valuable, but someone's going to be listening to it and they don't know who we are,
Sure.
right? They don't know our character. They don't know our track record. They don't know our intentions or our morals or ethics or any of those things. So if we give them content that's valuable, great. But before they would allow us to mentor them or speak into their life in certain other areas, they would want to be careful that we're the type of people that would warrant that, right? So I always say, just because, someone's a guru doesn't mean that they're your guru, right? And so you want to be really intentional about that. There's different words for it, and you even used a couple: mentorship versus coaching. Those are actually not the same thing. Although sometimes those words get kind of used back and forth like as if they were. I always think of mentorship as like someone who I'm watching what they do. Maybe I have an admiration for who they are, what they do, and I'm kind of learning by almost osmosis.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe there's some formalization to certain mentorship programs, et cetera, which is great. That's another level of system behind just kind of hanging around and watching somebody. versus, okay, well, we're going to meet once a week for 30 minutes and et cetera, right? A little more structure. A coach, right? At least the way I think of a coach is actually someone who's paid.
Okay. Yep.
Right. And more than likely they're paid by the person being coached. And so they are vested in your success, but they're third party such to the degree that they can ask you the hard questions, right? Some people say, oh, well, I'm going to be coached by my best friend, right? And although there is value there, that's a different type of relationship. Your best friend might not always want to ask you the hard question because there's risk of the relationship there, or like a spouse, for example, right? Now, again, those are different relationships that are incredibly valuable in different ways. But a professional coach is someone who is actually paid to help guide you toward your goal, ask you the tough questions when necessary, right? Very different than like a paid cheerleader.
Sure.
We don't need that, right? Hopefully we have people in our lives that we don't have to pay that are cheering for our success. We actually need someone who's willing to ask us the tough question at the right moment to help us self-discover how we might need to think differently on the journey toward our goals, right? And that's how I think of a coach. I've had some incredible ones. And by the way, like, there's people that have added value to my life that I don't know that I would put a title on other than like father. My dad, right, is a huge factor and has been a huge factor in my life. Some of my good friends, as I mentioned, different relationship, but they've added tons of value to my life. I've had coaches professional coaches that I paid ever since I got into the real estate industry. And that was a game changer for me. Still do. I still coach regularly every week. I don't think I've ever been without a coach in all the years I've been in real estate, which is 11, 12 years now. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is, no matter how accountable I think I am, I'm not nearly as accountable as I need to be in order to accomplish my goals. Good. And so someone can help me with that, right? Having a really great coach is a great way to kind of cheat. Right.
Okay.
And here's what I mean by that. A lot of great coaches are also coaching a lot of other people in the same space or industry as you are around the country, state, world, whatever. And they're gathering a whole bunch of the great ideas and information from all those clients. And generally they're sharing those with you or helping you think about something differently. Right. So it's like a cheat code on a game or whatever. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm talking to my old coach, Mike Fleming, who lives in Atlanta by phone 30 minutes every week for 6 years. But Mike's also coaching 70 other top leaders and agents across the country. And I'm learning from them through him. And hopefully they're learning from me through him.
Right.
And so that's another element of value that people forget about. But Mike is a good example of someone who, as a paid professional coach, had a profound impact on my life, the trajectory of my life, the way that I approach leadership specifically. I tell people often that Mike was like a second father to me for 6 years, and I have a great relationship with my own father. So that's saying something, right? And so that's one example. And there's so many that I would probably forget to mention. But I always encourage people to think about having a coach as a little bit different than maybe some of the other valuable relationships that they already have in their world.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, I mean, you, like you said, you have someone outside essentially the fishbowl of your world to get that view that's clear. You're paying, they're getting paid. I mean, it creates an accountability as well of like, gosh, if I'm paying this much money, like I got to get something out of it. It creates a momentum there. And I also think that it's so valuable as that leader too, where you've talked about your job is to look just a little farther forward. Or maybe a lot farther forward, but either way, you have someone now who you're looking to help you do that, which you owe to those that you're leading. That's incredible.
Yeah, it goes back to the comment I made earlier, Rick, which is, I think in order to be a good leader, you also have to be a good follower. So like in leadership, if you find yourself out in front, which you often are, and you can't identify anyone that you're following, you might be in a dangerous spot.
Right.
Whoever that may be for you, right? Maybe it's someone else in your industry. Maybe it's a coach. But if you're like, well, I'm the leader and everyone's following me, I don't know who I'm following. That's a scary spot to be in.
Yeah.
Right. Because, and here's the reason why. Others have gone before us. right? And if you look back at history, you look in the industry, it's like, sure, we're creating new things and we're inventing new ideas, no doubt about that. But from a leadership perspective and in general,
Yeah.
like others have succeeded before us, and for most of what we want to accomplish, although not all, there's someone that we can follow toward that, right? And so we should be seeking that out, right?
Yeah.
If we're expecting people to follow us, how are we demonstrating the ability to follow someone else too?
Right.
Right.
Right. So let's take a few minutes and talk about leadership when it comes to the challenges within an organization where maybe someone has to go, or that process of conversation ahead of time has to happen, things of that sort. I remember one thing you shared with me previously was something to the effect of, without problems, there's no real need for leadership, right? So inevitably you're on this court of public opinion. You have people depending on you. You have a vision that you're creating systems around to accomplish that goal with others. And yet in that gray area, in the art of all of this, there's the reality that sometimes you've got the wrong person on the team, or as Jim Collins would say, the wrong seat on the bus. So as a leader, that's such an important piece of how you follow that vision. So talk to us a little bit about, whatever you want to call it, conflict resolution, getting someone moved on the bus to a different spot, you name it. But how do you deal with that within an organization?
Well, it's never easy, right? And so anyone who would tell you that it is, I think is either not being truthful, or they haven't done much of it. Because again, when you're talking about people, right, in the context of removing someone from a role, or needing to change their role, or asking them to leave the organization because they've become a cancer or poison to an organization. These are all things that happen in leadership, sure, right? And hopefully not frequently, but on occasion it's going to happen, right? And it's always tough because it's other people and other people are involved. But I think you have to approach it, first of all, with the right amount of care for the other person, right? And the right amount of candor for the other person, right? So you have like, hey, Rick, we need to have a tough conversation. I need you to know that I care about you, but we're going to have a conversation that's required of, someone, like the example I always use is like, if we're like a family, that means sometimes we're going to have tough conversations, right, because we care about each other. Right. And so there's an element of balancing that care and candor when you're having those conversations. I think the defining piece of deciding when to have those conversations is, does this jeopardize the vision or the mission of the organization? Because that's actually the job of the leader, is to, quickly address anything that jeopardizes the organization, the vision, or the mission, however you think about that, right? Now, the trick is that not everything jeopardizes it equally, right? So some would say, I'm going to pick your battles, right? That's how it's often said, or which hill do you want to die on, right? I've heard it said that way too. But I think the mistake of leadership is thinking that everything matters equally. And I don't believe that's the case. Now, it matters still, but it just doesn't matter equally. So when you think about, urgently addressing something, it's going to depend on what the something is, back to the art over science piece, right? And there's a lot of other factors that would come into it. But when you think about conflict resolution, it's like, okay, well, what's in the best interest of the individual? What's in the best interest of the organization? And then how do we move forward, right? And, inside of a lot of the organizations I lead, and you're familiar with our belief system, right? We have a core set of beliefs and values that we've pre-agreed that's how we're going to treat each other. Now, it's easy to treat each other in accordance with a list of core values when it's all sunshine and lollipops.
Right.
Easy, right? And we're getting along great. Things are going smooth. This is great. I love this. Where it really shows its value is when we have a disagreement, or things aren't going so well, or someone's not performing in their role, or someone's operating outside of this agreement we've already made on how we're going to treat each other. And so it becomes the foundation that you can come back to, right? And I think that's super important because, again, it's a structure. It's pre-agreed to, and we can have this conversation along these lines rather than letting emotion kind of take it wherever it may go, which might not be a great spot.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And what you're talking about there is a system that allows productive conversation or clarity in conversation as to where things need to go.
Yeah. And an example would be like if one of our core beliefs is win-win or no deal. Now, if we haven't agreed to that, then how would we ever approach a difference of opinion?
Right.
Right? How would buyer agent and seller agent approach a negotiation if they haven't both first agreed to like win-win or no deal? Because the alternative is win-lose. And that's not anything that, at least in my organization, we want.
Right.
Win-win or no deal, which is a perfectly acceptable option. No deal. That happens.
Yep.
Right? But we certainly don't want a deal that's win-lose.
Right.
So that's an example of having a fundamental belief that we can come back to when things are hard, because that's the time we need a system and a model and a foundation the most.
Yeah.
This is when it's really hard, or there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of energy, frustration, all the emotions you could attach to it, right? Okay, well, let's take a deep breath and let's use this as our guide rather than our emotions as our guide.
Yeah. Yeah. Because those emotions can get a
risky,
crazy.
maybe not dangerous, but risky way of going about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Truth before emotions. I remember hearing an illustration one time when it was used as a bow and an arrow, and that the arrow is the truth and the emotions are the feathers in the back. And if you shoot the arrow that way, it's going to fly the way it should. But if you flip that arrow around and you stick those emotions, those feathers in front of that arrow, that thing's going wild, right? It's not going to be a pretty sight.
That's a great one. I love that.
So as we talk through this, Chase, is there anything that we should hit on really quick that you've got in your mind that you would say, this would be another really important part for people listening who want to develop more of their leadership skills? Anything that pops in your mind? Otherwise, I think we can talk about mindset as maybe one of our last pieces of today, but I want to make sure with your experience and background, if there's anything else we're missing, I'd love to touch on that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything missing, right? Like if I was going to encourage, other leaders listening to this, right? It would just be, hey, make the recommitment daily to continue getting better. And it's not because you're not good enough already. It's not because you don't have a whole lot of skill around what you're doing in leadership. It's because, as Craig Groeschel says, when the leader gets better, everybody wins. And so like it's recommitting to that process. And by the way, like you'd never get there.
Right.
And that could feel exhausting too. It's like, oh, when am I going to be there? When am I going to be the great leader that I hope to be? It's like, well, never. Because there's always more to learn. There's always growth available. The world and the people we lead are constantly changing. So, like submitting to that idea of having never arrived can put you in the right mental space to continue improving, all the while being content with where you are in the moment.
Yeah.
Right. I don't want to be here tomorrow because I want to make a stride forward, but I'm okay with where I'm at so far. That's easy to say and hard to do and hard to feel. So there's absolutely like a daily recommitment. Sometimes it's not even daily, Rick. Sometimes it's
one
minute by
minute,
yeah. Right? When things get challenging in leadership, it's like, oh my gosh, I thought I was going to have to recommit daily, but I'm going to have to recommit every second for the next 20 minutes because this is really hard. Right? And so I don't know if, we talked a little bit about it. That would just be encouragement. That's kind of my self-talk maybe coming out. It's like, if you feel called to it and you truly believe that leadership is about others, then you got to recommit to what that process looks like to get a little better every day.
Yeah. And that goes into that mindset. I mean, there's so much mindset approach to everything we're talking about here, but it is as much as you might have a coach and you have your team close to you and there's those relationships, it can be a lonely journey at times. And I'd love to take a couple minutes to talk about, how do you manage that? How have you seen other leaders manage that in a healthy way? Because sometimes there's that burnout in leadership, right? And so how do people get the staying power? How do people have a mindset where they can, at the end of a day that was really hard, where X person left, or this thing was said, or that thing happened with the budget, whatever, where they can just say, okay, I'm moving on. I've got this. How do you do it? How do you do that?
Well, it's not easy, right? And it depends on the challenge or the setback or the failure or whatever, right? But I think part of it is remembering why you're doing it in the first place, right? Some would say like reattaching it to your big why, or we talked about vision, right? You can use a few of those words almost interchangeably, but I'm not doing this because I expected it to be easy. I'm doing this because I have a bigger purpose, a bigger vision for why. So that can be helpful in pushing through some of those challenging moments and avoiding burnout, right? Like if you feel truly connected and passionate to a vision for your leadership and those that it serves, how would you ever get burnout?
Yeah.
Right. Long term. Now you might get tired and you might get burnout because you had a rough day or a rough week or a rough year. But you realize at some point as a leader that it's really challenging to opt out. Like, because you can opt out of a role or opt out of a company or opt out of something, but you don't just go from being a leader one day to not.
Yeah.
I don't think. Right.
I
So
don't
it's
think
like
so.
you're just going to end up in another space where you're going to have a new opportunity to grow, maybe in that same area. And so I remember that too, when one of the options that floats into your brain is quitting. It's like, okay, well, then what? What would I do if I did? Right. And by the way, like, it doesn't mean quitting's wrong or bad. It's just like, I'm just going to end up over here probably with the same challenge because I haven't figured out how to grow in such a way that I can address it well. So it's causing stress for me. It's causing burnout for me. It's causing whatever. Right. So, having that perspective, that kind of long-term perspective, maybe. I heard a quote last week and I was sharing it that, nothing is permanent and pervasive. Everything is temporary and specific. So when, and really that's just offering an alternate perspective on the current challenge. Yeah. When you're in the challenge, it feels like it's going to crush you, right? Depending on what it is.
Sure.
It feels like it's going to affect every area of your life. It's never going to go away. There's no solution. And like, if this is how it's going to be, I need to do something different, right? That's how it feels when you're in it. Chances are when you look back on it 20 years later, 30 years later, for most things, you're going to realize that it was temporary and specific as a challenge. It wasn't, permanent and pervasive.
Yeah.
And so getting some of that perspective in the moment, again, easy to say, hard to do.
Sure.
But it's almost like, and it probably sounds silly, but I used to describe it this way early on in my leadership journey. I could almost like see myself dealing with the challenge, and like in my brain, I would kind of like fly up and away and like look at it from a different angle. And I know that sounds weird, but what it helped me do is realize like, this is just a stop on the journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. This is just a piece in the path. It's a moment in the path rather than like the whole world. It's my whole world right this second if I'm stuck in that challenge. So I think that's part of it. There's no replacement for like putting yourself in the right environment as a leader, right? You mentioned kind of like leadership being lonely. Well, it can be if you allow it to be, right? So like put yourself in the right environment. Part of that's mentors and coaching. Part of that is in relationship with other leaders. Right? Like sometimes as leaders, we isolate. I don't know why. I don't know whether that's like a protective thing or a subconscious thing, but ultimately, if you're dealing with challenges in leadership, someone else is dealing with the same ones, without a doubt. And by the way, they're probably not very far from you. You're probably in relationship with them already. So getting in those environments where it's okay and safe to have those conversations around what you're challenged with and how you're addressing it, and then getting ideas from others on how they're addressing it, can be really valuable. So you don't feel lonely in that headspace.
Yep.
Because, while we're influencing people and leading organizations as an example, or communities or whatever, part of our job is solving problems. Mm-hmm. Most of our job is solving problems. And so that can wear on you if you don't have an outlet for that, or you're not putting yourself in an environment that allows for that to be okay.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so I think there's some key elements there that are super important to pushing through those tough moments or those tough seasons. and really making sure that just like you would offer effort toward becoming a better leader, we should be offering effort toward improving our mindset and our ability to work through those things as leaders, because that's a part of what we do, right?
Yep. I really appreciated, just a little aha for me as you shared that, where, you know, we have those coaches, those mentors kind of in front of us, sort of the point of the spear that we can look to for that extra growth and our ability as leaders to move forward. And then we have the people we're leading. But as you share that, like, who else is out there, right? For those listening, like, who else is maybe not in your exact spot, because no one ever will be, but who's close to that proximity wise, and they're out there. Like you said, I mean, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Leadership is leadership. Things change, but leadership is still there.
Yeah.
And so to kind of have that, like, where's the gap in your world, right? Do you need that coach in your life? Do you have people walking alongside you in your industry who you can bounce ideas off of? And as a leader, do you have people following you? Because if you don't, and you say you're a leader, right, there's other questions to be asked. Okay, so to wrap this up, Chase, what about the people who are listening to this, who maybe they're younger, maybe they've been out of a leadership role for a long time, maybe they've never really had an opportunity, but they have that call, like you said, like if you're in a leadership role and you step out of it, you're probably going to find yourself there. Like, for those people who maybe are feeling that encouragement and kind of that fire getting lit in them as they hear you speak today, how would you encourage them directly?
That's a good question. I would say, get into motion around what you feel called to in leadership, right? Like, leaders lead. So like, you're probably already leading in certain areas of your life. So just look around, right? We covered it already, but if you're a parent, just look to your kids, right? Uh-huh. If you have a significant other, spouse, look to them, because you're leading them too, right? And so oftentimes people think, well, I'm not a leader. It's like, well, what about your kids? Well, what about your wife or your husband or whatever, right? Like, you probably already are. So recommit to the areas that you are a leader in first, right? If you have those. And second, like, start leading.
Just take the step.
Start leading. Like, start taking the lead on a project, or volunteering to, lead a group of people at church or at work or in the community, right? Like, that's the practice ground we talked about, right? And by the way, do it because in part you feel called to it and there's a fire there, but do it for the other people.
Yeah.
So if you can find a way to lead inside of stuff you're already passionate about, that's the best place to start.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, the hobbies that you may have, or organizations that you're part of or involved in as a family, like, start there, because again, the whole world's starving for leadership. So if you raise your hand in any of those and say, hey, Rick, hey, my name's Chase, and, I don't know if I'm going to be any good at this, but I'd really like to add value here and lead anything that might be supportive. Nobody's going to turn you down, because there's just not a lot of people doing that.
Right.
So like,
right.
It's another thing I say to encourage, leaders, is there's no shortage of opportunity to lead if you're looking. So just raise your hand and trust me, that'll get you a long way, because most people won't even take that step. Right. And get around other people that are on that journey with you. Some have gone before you, some are right beside you, some you're going to be leading along the journey, right? Like, put yourself in those conversations and those relationships, because those will continue to feed you and encourage you when things get challenging, and rest assured they will in leadership often.
Yep.
Right. So like, take heart, you're not the only one. And that's why it's so important. That's probably why you feel called to it in some way. That's where you can truly add value to other people, because it's hard.
Right.
And that's fine. That's why it's worth it.
Yeah. Well, and that does bring me to one more question. Why do you love leadership? Right? Because there's a lot that's hard, and we've covered some of those things, but what do you love about it?
That's a great question, because there's lots of moments you don't love about it, or I don't love about it. Right. And so again, going back to like, what I do love about it is it's an opportunity for me to help other people achieve their full potential. Right. That's part of my personal mission, is to help other people realize the potential that I personally believe is already inside of them. It's not something that they're seeking. they're seeking it, but it's not something that's outside of them. It's not something that they have to go and get. It's something that they have to unlock.
Yeah.
And that's what I love, right? If I can play one little tiny part in unlocking something that already exists, but maybe they weren't aware of it, or they weren't connected to it, or they didn't know it existed inside of them.
Right.
That to me is what I love.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so reminding myself of that when there's parts of it I don't love, and there's parts of that for everything.
Sure. You got
right?
it.
Is super important.
Yeah.
Right. When it gets really tough, really challenging, or there's setbacks or failures or conflict, right? It's like, okay, but what I live for is helping other people unlock that thing that already exists inside of them. There's nothing more fulfilling to me than that.
Love it. Okay. Well, Chase, I appreciate you, as does everyone else who's listening, you joining us today. So I want to make sure we highlight that you actually have a podcast with the legendary Bruce Hardy called The Real Look. And so I want to just plead, if you are listening to this, especially if you're in the real estate industry, check out that podcast. You won't be disappointed. We'll have the information in the our podcast notes as well.